Welcome, everyone, to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's series of virtual conversations. I'm Davia Nelson of NPR's Kitchen Sisters, and I'm your moderator for the conversation today, Food for Thoughts. Will restaurants survive? I don't even like asking that question. Joining me is Soleil Ho, restaurant critic of the San Francisco Chronicle and co-founder of the podcast Racist Sandwich. Saru Jayaraman, president of One Fair Wage and co-editor of the new book, Bite Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning, and Caleb Zegas, executive director of La Cocina, the groundbreaking kitchen incubator here in the Bay Area, empowering low-income women and immigrants to food businesses and food projects, and helping make a good income. I want to welcome you all. Thank you all for being part of this today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Saru, I want to open this conversation with you. I wondered, well, first of all, congratulations on your book. And it couldn't be more perfect timing, except for the part about the book tour. But there you go. But in terms of the ideas and what you have to say, and I wondered if you could begin by just laying the groundwork of what amount of people, what's the scale of people working in the restaurant world right now and the impact of how many people this world is impacting right now?
Yeah. So prior to the pandemic, the restaurant industry was the second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer, both in California and in the United States. 13.5 million workers nationally, about 1.75 million in California. So California had the largest and fastest growing industry in the largest and fastest growing industry in the United States. By far the absolute lowest paying sector in the United States, both at the national level and in California. And that fact, the fact that we've got one of the largest and fastest growing sectors with the lowest paying wages prior to the pandemic, can really be attributed to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA, which really represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens. Many of us think of restaurants in America as mostly independent restaurants, mom and pop restaurants. The truth is that the National Restaurant Association and the chains that are a part of it set the standards in so many ways especially for employment conditions for workers, but also in terms of how food is sourced, how animals are treated, how the environment is treated. They truly do set the standards because they wield enormous power in Congress, and not as much power in Sacramento and the state of California, but they wield power here as well. And so they're enormously powerful. They have lobbied over the last 150 years to keep wages as low as possible. Some may know that their predecessor, basically the predecessor to the National Restaurant Association, lobbied at emancipation to be able to hire newly freed slaves and not pay them anything and have them live entirely on tips, which is where the notion of tips as wage replacement rather than tips as an extra or bonus on top of a wage originates from. It originates from slavery and the desire to hire Black people and not pay them anything. And so I just think it's important that as much as we have this conversation today, thinking about all the amazing, beautiful kinds of restaurants we all care about and love, that truly the standards in this industry are very much set by corporations that have a very long and ugly past, a very long and ugly history of pushing inequality in the United States, of really being at the forefront of driving inequality in the United States, both because this is the largest and fastest growing industry with the lowest wages, and because so much of the foundations of the industry are built on a history of racism in the United States. And I can share so much more about that, but I just think in this moment in particular with the pandemic, it's important to understand that bigger structural context, because we saw the pandemic basically reveal, wide open for everybody to see all the very deep inequalities and injustices in this sector. And it's important when we see those things to understand that they're very much driven intentionally by very powerful political forces, namely a trade lobby that sets standards in this industry.
Soleil, you are someone who eats out 350 nights a year or has 350 meals out a year. That has not been the case probably in the last several months. I'm wondering what you've been writing about, what you've been thinking about, and how you think about that question: will restaurants survive?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting kind of change for me. There are really it's not really fair to review a restaurant based on its takeout or its delivery options, because I mean, any order of French fries you get is going to be absolutely atrocious if you get it delivered. So what I've been writing about instead is labor. Also just kind of like what Sarah was mentioning, people generally don't understand like why restaurants are the way they are, and also like why they're suffering the way they are. And I think that the weird thing about it is like, it's just, there's so much like really intricate economic and like historical stuff that built up the system the way we see it and experience it. So I found that my job was explaining that, talking about policy, talking about the federal money that was or was not coming to restaurants and why that was happening. Talking about wages, talking about restaurant workers as well, and talking with restaurant workers to see like what they're going through, how they're experiencing this moment, and just what we can do for them, and just to preserve their livelihoods, but also think about like in terms of the cities that we live in too, like what do we want, right? Because when we miss restaurants, we don't just miss the spaces. We miss so many things that are symbolic about restaurants. We miss community spaces. We miss interfacing across cultures, right? We miss like all of these really beautiful venues where people can do their art and their craft and express that. We don't necessarily need restaurants for that, but those are the things that we really want. So talking about that, in addition to talking about labor, talking about undocumented workers and what they're going through, for me, my job is really pivoted into news gathering and just presenting like experience.
And what has stuck out for you the most? What keeps striking you when you think about, let's just start with restaurant workers, for example?
What strikes me is that we keep talking about the future of restaurants or the new normal or reopening without really asking them how they feel about it, and a lot of them do reach out to me privately to talk about that stuff. And certainly throughout the sort of like anti-police violence protests and anti-Black racism protests, like a lot of them have reached out to me to talk about working conditions, right? And kind of buoyed by this movement. So yeah, there's been a lot of labor discussion, and they haven't felt heard, and they haven't really felt consulted on a lot of this. We just seem to be rushing into reopening. And they're terrified, a lot of them have told me they just like scrub themselves down right after a shift because they've been walking around in everyone else's muck for hours. And that kind of stuff is really important.
I wonder, Caleb, I'm going to ask you questions in 1 second, but I just want to ask you, so Soleil, if you were to, just thinking about what you just said, if you were to hold a town hall, to have the community, let's just pick San Francisco. This could be happening in Minneapolis. It could be happening anywhere in America. A town hall about we're opening back up. Restaurants are at the heart of our town. They are in part our public space. Saru, I think you speak about that too. Maybe you'll speak to this at some point as well. But what would the 3 questions at the town hall be? So no pressure, Soleil, none whatsoever.
Okay. Well, I guess conceptually, right? Like, how do we separate the idea of reopening from the whole like making money aspect, right? Because the money part is what I think is guiding reopening. So how do we remove that as a variable and make it so people can pay rent, they can feed themselves and their families without having to rush into a potentially dangerous situation? So I guess generating ideas in that regard, and then asking restaurant workers if they're comfortable, right? Just to testify to that. And then asking everyone else like what they need to feel safe. I think there's a lot of it's kind of Wild Westy, right? There's not a lot of, there is guidance from the city in San Francisco, but I think the actual holding to account for following that guidance is really uneven. So checking in with that would be really important.
Caleb Zegas from La Cocina. I wonder first if you could paint a picture for those who don't know about La Cocina, what it is, who it is, what you do, and then how everyone has been faring in these just rugged, excruciating times there.
Sure. La Cocina was founded out of grassroots economic development work that was happening in the Mission District in San Francisco in the late 80s and early 90s. And those grassroots organizers identified that a lot of people, mostly women, immigrant women and women of color, were cooking food out of their homes and writing business plans for food businesses, but never launching. And when they asked those women why they weren't launching, the answer was lack of affordable commercial kitchen space. And La Cocina was the idea that you could provide affordable commercial kitchen space, industry-specific technical assistance, and these really talented entrepreneurs who were facing immense barriers to entry in the marketplace, move from the informal economy to the formal economy and from income patching to asset generation. I've been there in almost every conceivable role since 2005, and we've been able to show that if you remove or at least address those barriers to entry in the marketplace, that your outputs in our industry look entirely different. We've had 55 businesses reach economic or operational self-sufficiency prior to the pandemic. They've opened up 33 brick and mortar locations between them. They've been named to all kinds of acknowledgments for their talent and skill. They generate millions of dollars a year in revenue and hundreds of jobs. And we can't solve the problem of the barriers to entry, but we can act as a metaphor for an unequal economy and a potential vision of what an equitable economy could look like. And I think to, both what Saru and Soleil were speaking to, these are often the restaurants we work with are an act of economic freedom for the entrepreneurs themselves. They're low-wage workers often who have been hustling on the side to find a way that their families can feel free. And their restaurant is that path to economic freedom. And part of the underlying assumption of the work at La Cocina is that if they are given the opportunity to be leaders in our industry, that they can affect the kind of change and build the kind of city that we'd prefer to see. So where we are today is that, those businesses universally have seen 70 to 100% decline in their sales. None of those businesses are elastic when it comes to capital, so they have no capacity to absorb a multi-month shutdown. And rent deferment is really just debt. It's not a forgiveness. It's not, all it means is that they will owe this much money later on the same lease terms that they had previously. So I think you're really looking at a bleak scenario for the entrepreneurial community that we're in. And I think the same extends for all of their staff who run the gamut and are some of the more vulnerable people in our population. And I think to Soleil's point, nobody wants to go back to work to be unsafe, and none of our restaurant owners want to open if they can't feel safe in their spaces or if their employees can't feel safe. So you're in a really complicated time for them without a lot of large-scale assistance or a clear path to opening provided by anybody. So it's scary. I think there's a lot of innovation, inspiration, resiliency that I could point to in the communities that doesn't need to feel pessimistic. There's a really big challenge in front of us, that the pandemic is one of them. The economic crisis that's going to come afterwards is another one. And absent meaningful attention to both of those, that the people who have been running these industries in a vulnerable position for so long are going to bear the brunt of that impact.
What has happened at La Cocina itself? Has anyone been going there? Is there any cooking for the community? What's been going on there over these 3 months?
Yeah, we run a 4,400 square foot shared use commercial kitchen space, which you can imagine is a complicated endeavor in a time of social distancing. So when we anticipated closure a little bit early, and we implemented a couple of different things across the organization. The first was to encourage all of our businesses to close their doors, and we did the same for La Cocina, and unfortunately to lay off as much of their staff as they were able to do, because the unemployment insurance benefits were going to be a better route for income for employees than owner payouts, since our owners don't have any money. And La Cocina sort of followed the same. We established an emergency relief fund. We raised over $600,000 that we distributed in direct cash payments to our entrepreneurs for them to do what they want, either personal bills or in some cases allocate it to employees or the business owners themselves who can't access federal assistance programs. And then then we worked on rent abatement with lawyers across the board, because I think rent abatement is the only way that these businesses are going to be able to make a comeback. As an organization, our sort of phase 2, which we began about a month and a half ago, was looking for revenue generating opportunities. And the first of those has been our community food box, which is essentially aggregated prepared foods from La Cocina businesses, where 100% of the sales are going to La Cocina businesses, with a pickup model from La Cocina, and now a delivery model with all the delivery dollars going to La Cocina businesses because they're driving it and delivering it themselves. And then I think we'll look towards a phase 3, and phase 3 will include hopefully a greater capacity to accept some of the government meal program opportunities, feeding vulnerable populations. I know High Road Kitchens is doing things like that. World Central Kitchen, SF New Deal, La Cocina is an approved vendor for that. So hopefully us being able to be a central aggregator of those opportunities to businesses that might not know how to go through that process if they don't have a little helping hand on the side. And then I guess the most exciting thing I could think about is we want to have a San Francisco drive-in movie theater, so you can feel relatively safe inside of your car, have great food from La Cocina businesses, and maybe do something besides just tune into wonderful Zoom conversations. So we're working on that as some optimism. But the goal is to get entrepreneurs to 50% of pre-COVID sales, and the hope that they can sustain themselves and their families at 50% for at least 18 months to 2 years in order to even begin to think about what we're calling regeneration. So to both Sarah and Solei's point, not a reestablishment of the status quo, but hopefully some toolbox that gives entrepreneurs a better set of opportunities when they reopen: childcare, healthcare, mutual aid.
Saru, would you pick up from there? Because I know you've been thinking so much about the issues of unemployment, of who got what, and I know you have helped, you're behind a fund that has also been trying to compensate people in some way and help them through. Do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. I think what's important to know is that the pandemic, as I mentioned, really revealed so much that was wrong with the industry prior to the pandemic. So I was starting to explain that one of the key issues we've been fighting against for a very long time is the subminimum wage for tipped workers, which exists not in California, but in 43 states in the United States. It is a direct legacy of slavery, and today the subminimum wage for workers who earn tips in the United States is $2.13 at the federal level. That is the wage for about 6 million workers in the United States who earn tips. And it is a direct legacy of slavery, but it's also a source of incredible economic instability for a largely majority female workforce. 70% of these workers are women. They're largely women who work at IHOPs and Denny's and Olive Gardens across the country. They have the highest rates of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry in the United States. That was prior to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, we used the words living tip to mouth. They would get tips during the day and take that home, and that's what they fed their kids with. 40% of these women are single mothers, but they themselves would eat family meal. They'd go in, and their only meal they would eat during the day is what they would get at the restaurant prior to the shift. So you had a lot of people, millions of people living tip to mouth. I mean, I just think zooming even out of restaurants and the food industry, our country was already at the highest level of income inequality in the history of our nation prior to the pandemic. So we were sitting already on a razor's edge precipice of disaster because we were already at such extremes in terms of inequality, and a large swath of the American society, more than 1/3 of working Americans living in poverty, barely able to survive. I mean, many of the workers I'm describing who work at IHOP and Denny's and feed their kids on tips would tell us, I work 3 jobs, or I work 2 jobs and I live in my car because I can't afford rent. I mean, this is the reality for so much of America and so much of the restaurant industry. that is how we have the prices we have in most of the country, is because workers are not paid. They're paid $2.13. So that was prior to the pandemic. With the pandemic, we saw 10 million workers nationwide and 1.1 million workers in California lose their jobs. And about 44% of all applicants nationally for unemployment insurance have been denied or not able to access unemployment. About 60% of tipped workers and restaurant workers have not been able to access unemployment insurance, or have gotten it very, very late, like 4 months later. And that is largely because in so many states, we heard these heartbreaking stories of workers saying, I'm being told that my $2 or $3 wage plus tips is not enough to meet the minimum state threshold to qualify for unemployment insurance, which is insane. These are huge chains that have lobbied for 150 years to keep the wage at $2. They received $10, $20, $30 million in PPP that was intended for small businesses through the CARES Act. And meanwhile, their millions of workers are getting zero because they're being told that they were paid too little to access benefits. It's much worse for workers of color. Workers of color tend to be in more casual restaurants where they got cash tips, which were often not reported. And so these workers are saying, the unemployment insurance office is saying, it looks like you didn't work at all. Your boss never reported your tips. And so what we're seeing right now is great, much bigger than the Great Depression. I don't think people understand the level of destitution that we're about to see. I mean, we did start a fund March 16th. Nearly 200,000 workers applied to our National Emergency Fund. We've raised $23 million to hand out cash payments to workers. It is a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. But 83% of the workers who applied said they do not have money for 2 weeks of groceries to feed their children. 95% said they don't have money to pay rent and mortgage. I think we're going to see the level of evictions and homelessness in the next month or two as rent cancellations and rent postponement, I would call it, or moratoriums start to be lifted. You are going to see massive numbers of people, especially in the service sector, living in their cars or living in the street. What choice do people have? Or doubling up in housing situations that spread the pandemic. What choice do people have? And so, just the unemployment insurance system was revealed to be a total failure. The sub-minimum wage to be a total failure. And so I will say the silver lining in all of this is that both millions of workers and an amazing number of employers, restaurant owners, have really seen what we've seen, just the devastation of the sector, the fact that these things never worked to begin with, and have been willing to fight for change. So millions of workers who perhaps weren't part of our movement, weren't trying to fight for higher wages or increased equity, are suddenly saying, my God, if the state is telling me I was paid too little to receive benefits that I paid taxes to receive, then probably I was paid too little and I should not have to go to work for that same wage. Especially, put aside the safety concerns. That Soleil mentioned, that's horrible in and of itself. But in most states, workers are being asked to go back to work for $2 and $3 when tips are down between 75 and 90%. And they're being told by the state unemployment insurance offices, if you don't take that job, whatever job comes your way, you will lose your benefits. So people are being made to choose between their lives and their livelihood. And I am not talking about a sliver of our population. I'm talking about the nation's largest workforce being told, go back to work, expose yourself for nothing, no money, because there are no tips, or lose your benefits. Those are your choices.
And when you say we're seeing little bits of movement from the restaurant industry, I'm wondering what's in there.
It go on forever, but
even benefits and
employers are suddenly saying, some of whom fought us on this issue, we're going to raise our wages. We want to pay a full minimum wage with tips on top. We want to pay $15. We want to move away from this system. We created a racial equity toolkit for how employers can desegregate racially. And we've been inundated with requests from restaurant owners and even large restaurant associations that sprung up since the pandemic started, associations of independent restaurants, asking us to teach them how to go through this racial equity toolkit, asking them to teach them how to profitably move to a higher wage. And I really give them kudos because it seems counterintuitive to some. Why are employers seeking to raise wages or change their ways in the middle of struggling through a pandemic? The reason is that a lot of them are saying, listen, I'm having to reinvent my entire business model from scratch. And so while I'm doing that, I want to rethink everything that I knew in my heart didn't seem right about this industry, but I wasn't able to take the time to pause and think, how would I make this change? I wasn't able to see how change was possible. And now change is being forced on me. And so I am willing to rethink things that are a legacy of slavery and causing harassment and causing discrimination. I'm willing to reimagine everything about how I run my business.
Soleil, jump in here. I know you have reimagined so much about how we grow, serve, present food, where we do that, who does that. What are you thinking? Going back to that question, will restaurants survive? Take on another piece of that from your point of view.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it seems to me that I hope that this analogy isn't in poor taste, but it does seem really similar to Hurricane Katrina in that it has accelerated so many things that were sort of like simmering below the surface of the industry. It accelerated evictions, it accelerated unemployment, it also accelerated a lot of change and pivots as this weird kind of the side kind of symptoms, right? The end results, the outcomes of this big disaster. And you know, there have been a lot of really creative kinds of changes. And there also has been, just from what I've seen, a lot of out of work cooks and chefs and servers and just like people in the industry who have kind of turned to these marginalized ways of entrepreneurship that I think people have always done, right? To speak to Kayla's point, like people, what we call like cutely the side hustle right now, where people are like baking bread and selling them on Venmo or Instagram or whatever. Like that is what people have done, especially women, especially immigrant women have done kind of like in this gray market thing for a very long time. And I think I'm seeing more and more people being more amenable to that, you know, selling enchiladas on Facebook or whatever, you know, like that sort of thing is becoming a lot more common. So I'm actually kind of weirdly excited about that too. Just people are able and like people are actually willing to kind of look for those people to take finances in their own hands at least a little bit and sort of decentralize the experience of like sharing food and selling food. At the same time, that's not necessarily enough to pay rent, which is a huge problem too. I'm currently working on a story about undocumented workers, which is why this is like in my head right now. A lot of them are dealing with the sort of rent deferral or postponement thing too. And some of the folks I talked to were living in their cars and just like unable to do anything. And the point that Saru brings up too about the choice between your health and your money has been a question from the beginning for undocumented workers who don't qualify for any federal aid. They don't qualify for unemployment insurance or any of the benefits. A lot of them were just kind of cut loose with nothing. So that's why I realized very quickly, that's why you saw so many GoFundMes and less like official kind of fundraisers for restaurants, because that's who they were trying to cover. They didn't say that outright, but they were trying to provide for those folks on their staff who would receive nothing. For them, that choice between their health and their money was already just a constant. You know, they don't necessarily take sick days. They're not used to that. They can't like afford the lost wages or the lost tips or anything like that. And so they've been working throughout this pandemic, you know, and this choice that we're seeing now among, you know, workers who are citizens or with papers as restaurants are reopening, that's kind of this delayed thing that people have already been dealing with. And I find that really, for my readers, you know, who are really interested, they come to me for restaurant news and restaurant stuff. I think if they really care about restaurants, they need to care about all of this too, because this is as much a reality of the industry as anything on the plate, you know.
Caleb, come back in here. What are you thinking as you're listening to the two of them and thinking about going forward with La Cocina and the vulnerability of those women and the strength, both.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me listening to both Soleil and Saru that, I mean, it's important to acknowledge that this is a particularly American problem at the moment. Like, it's not that there aren't other countries that are dealing with this same set of circumstances that haven't been able to better fortify their population to survive. And I particularly think about that in the sense of how we deliver healthcare and other essential services to residents of this country, and what a crime it is that as a country we're not able to do that. And as a result, we shift all of the responsibility for health and well-being into the hands of entrepreneurs who are forced into a system of capitalism that serves no one but people with capital. And you're just seeing that happen over and over again. And it even in a capitalist country, it doesn't have to happen the way that we have chosen and continue to reinforce the way that it happens here. So, I mean, I think it's important to say that, because that is something we can change. Like, there are other countries that have not abandoned the sense of a marketplace or restaurants who have restaurant workers who are not worried about this false choice. And it's not impossible to imagine. It doesn't even take that much imagination to be able to point to places that do it. I think, to Soleil's point, like, the informal economy is the way that La Cocina thinks about people who have been working in the gray spaces. And that's been happening forever. And honestly, every major innovation you see in the food space happened in the informal economy first. You had taco trucks before food trucks. You had meal delivery in informal communities before you had DoorDash. You had all of these things happening first. And I think it's where you should look now to see where the future is going to be. I mean, that's always people who are facing barriers to entry. Those barriers are artificial. They're put up in order to protect interests. Once the interests understand where the opportunity is, they tend to take them. So, I find some hope in the sort of thing that Saru was talking about, of people coming together, collective action, cooperative building, honestly, like restated values. I really do think that requires federal level financial investment. Like she said, 23 million sounds like a ton of money, but it's nothing compared to what the challenge is. And so we need real money and a real social safety net that supports people so that we can ask businesses to be parts of their community as opposed to sort of victims or conspirators against the people in their own communities. I guess the last thing I think about is, when Soleil's talking, I think it is a lot like like any natural disaster. I also think that the thing that we've lived through at La Cocina that is most similar is the mortgage crisis of 2009. And my biggest fear is that you're going to see a replication of what recovery looked like in the mortgage crisis, where people who didn't have any money were forced to give up their assets into a marketplace that absorbed those assets, put poor people into debt, and then flip those assets for riches, essentially. And I think there's this risk in our industry that a lot of small shops are going to close because they can't absorb this. Something's going to come in and fill that retail vacancy. It's going to change the nature of your cities. It's going to change the nature of your suburbs. And to Saru's point, it's going to just widen this inequality gap, which is like we should all find unacceptable. And so, I think we need to be advocating that that's not something we can stomach as a people. That we're not willing to let that be the solution to this problem, that the marketplace is not equipped to solve this problem without massive intervention, and that intervention needs to center equity, needs to center opportunity, and needs to lead us towards the kind of country that we want to live in. So, I think our entrepreneurs know how to do that. And so the honest answer is we should be talking to them. I have all kinds of good ideas, but the entrepreneurs who are putting their staff on their back, despite the fact that they don't have more than 2 weeks of capital, they're doing this work right now. They're figuring out how their communities can and should be resilient, and they should be the ones who are telling our representatives and making that policy happen.
So let's, Saru, you especially talk about it here in your work and in Fight Back, a call to action. So let's go around here about where we are now and what we can do. We consumers, we customers, we citizens. Lay out some suggestions for people to sort of open their eyes and actions for people to take.
Yeah. So, first of all, we have more power as consumers right now than I think really ever. There's finally this recognition of these workers as essential. There's finally an understanding that we are interdependent. I mean, if the pandemic has taught us nothing, it is that when the poorest among us are sick, we all get sick. When the poorest among us can't take care of themselves, we all end up losing. So I'm hoping that has opened consumers' minds to the idea that we have not just power as consumers, but a responsibility and a duty to make sure that the people who are cooking, preparing, delivering, serving our food are taken care of. A duty both to them and frankly to ourselves and our own health and well-being. And so the number one thing I would ask is, we have created this High Road Kitchen. If you're in California, we've created this High Road Kitchens program with Governor Newsom. Support the restaurants that are part of High Road Kitchens. It's highroadkitchens.com. Those are restaurants that have committed to going through our equity toolkit and training program and are feeding thousands of people free meals. But you can donate meals through the program. It's a sort of pay as you go, so you could pay $10 or $15 for your meal and subsidize multiple other free meals. So support called highroadkitchens.com. And beyond just being a feeding program, because there are a lot of great feeding programs out there, for us it's about shaping relief in a way that reshapes the future. That is what we're all about. It shouldn't just be about providing people with cash and food right now. Honestly, that does not solve the problem. What does solve the problem is relief that encourages change. And that's what High Road Kitchens is about. It's about providing relief to restaurant owners that are committed to increasing equity in the restaurant industry. So supporting High Road Kitchens in California or in New York, we've just started with Mayor de Blasio in New York City. But beyond that, wherever you are, wherever you eat, when you order delivery, takeout, or eventually when you go back to work, please talk to the manager or the owner and let them know your values. Let them know, as a consumer, I want you to know I value livable wages for everybody, people not being entirely dependent on tips to feed their families, so getting a livable wage from you, the employer. I want to make sure they have paid sick leave and PPE, that they have a way to get health care for themselves, and that people of color are represented on the dining floor as managers, servers, bartenders as much as they are in the kitchen. That's what I want to see, and that's important to me as a consumer. So the most easiest thing for you to do as a consumer is to say those things every time you order, every time you eat out, not to the workers, ask to speak to the manager or the owner and communicate those things. That's one. Two is that you are all people who are represented, whether you vote or not, you are represented by elected officials. And so this is the moment for us as consumers to demand change for workers in this industry. This is the moment to call Congress and say, this industry must pay a full minimum wage before these workers go back to work. Before this industry fully reopens next year, we need a full, fair, livable minimum wage of $15 across the board, because tips are down 75 to 90%. People cannot live on tips right now. They don't exist. People are just not tipping for takeout and delivery they do for the way they do for a full meal. So you can't expect workers to live on $2 and $3 an hour. That's two. Please call your congressperson and say, we need to pass one fair wage before we go back to work. And also, please condition any blanket relief to this industry paying a full, fair, livable minimum wage. Do not bail out this industry without actual conditions that require the industry to move in a more equitable, livable direction. Otherwise, we're just going to end up back where we were. How dumb of us as a nation if we're just going to go back right where we were when we were when everything showed us we were not in the right place to begin with. So that's two. And then three, I would say that is possible both at the federal level and at the state level. At the states are the ones that control unemployment insurance. We are going to see at least a third to a quarter of these 13 million workers long-term unemployed. I want to say that again. Of the 13 million workers nationally and 1.1 million in New York, we know that somewhere between a quarter to a third, maybe more, of restaurants may not come back. And that is sad for those restaurant owners and those restaurants. It is a situation of desperation for those workers. So you are talking about a quarter to a third of 13 million nationally, 1.1 million in the state of California that will be long-term unemployed. I don't mean 6 months or a year or even 2 years. It could be up to 5 years long-term unemployment for millions of people. And so on that note, we need to tell both our state elected officials and our federal elected officials, we need a social safety net. These are hardworking people who want to work but cannot, and they should get long-term unemployment, or we should think about a public jobs program, or we should support the development of statewide worker cooperatives where they can form their own businesses. But we need to be caring for those long-term unemployed because, again, all of these workers are not in this situation because they don't want to work or because they've chosen low-wage jobs or poverty or destitution or homelessness. They are in this situation because of a structural, political, historical, intentional situation in which large trade associations of large chains have set the standards, have set up the system, have set up the structures in our industry in a way that exploits workers to the fullest.
Soleil, what do you want to see? What are suggestions you have for customers, consumers, the general citizenry of this town and other places as well?
So to Sarah's point, there's all of these things you can ask for with minimum wage and how much you want the laborers in the staff at these restaurants to be paid. And generally speaking, restaurateurs, restaurant owners are terrified of customers not wanting to pay more for those things, right? Like there's this perception that a customer isn't going to pay more than, $10 for a burrito. And that's why they have to keep all the costs in line in a particular way. So if you are making those asks of a restaurant owner, you could also say like, yes, and I'm willing to pay for it too. Like I will pay $15 for this thing or $20 for this thing if that means someone can, get really good healthcare benefits or dental benefits or, pay time off, that sort of stuff. That's substantial, I think that is reassuring. And that is also like a really big vote of confidence because you can just, they want you to come back and they also want to feel like, okay, they can make these choices and not be, yelled at on Yelp or whatever for being too expensive and for their cuisine or for whatever. That's a big one. And another thing that I've really been interested in and trying to tell people as much as possible is that if you're going to order takeout or delivery, please call directly. A lot of restaurants and restaurant owners and people have been trying to figure out how to do in-house delivery and retain staff as delivery drivers or bicyclists or whatever because of the fees that they're being charged by DoorDash and Postmates and Uber Eats and all of those companies. In San Francisco, I know in particular, there has been a cap on delivery commissions and takeout commissions that has expired. So now those caps are raising up again. That's sometimes 30% of a total bill goes to that app. That's money that the restaurant isn't seeing, right? There have been some pretty interesting viral receipts and invoices that people have posted from like a month's worth of orders at a restaurant and how much money is taken out of that profit by those companies. And it's really interesting to see how $1,000 becomes $300 really quickly because of all of that. So I would highly encourage consumers, if you are trying to order takeout because you think you want to support the restaurants in your community, please just call, please just walk over or get someone to grab stuff for you because that really does help. And the other thing would just be, I've asked, part of my work too is asking restaurant owners what do you want to see? What kind of support is really helpful for you? A lot of them do say that gift cards help. And so, if you are not comfortable going out as things are reopening, but you still want to support a restaurant, again, if you have the means and the time to actively support these restaurants, that is part of declaring what kind of community and what kind of neighborhood you want to see persist. Like if you, I hate to be all disastery, right? But they can easily be replaced by chains, and is that what you want? So one kind of suggestion that I have for people who aren't comfortable going out to restaurants or exposing themselves in that way is just support them in monetary ways, however you can, but also don't treat it like, they owe you anything. It should be sort of a reflection of your values, and also like think of it as like patronage in a sense. But they're probably not going to be able to provide or make good on that gift card for a long time. Just having a little bit more forgiveness in that realm is really helpful for everyone.
I think it's also a kind of sense of esprit and a sense of we are with you, and just that kind of psychological boost, that kind of support, something as basic as a gift card. It's not structural change. It's getting through that day, but it matters, I think, those things as well. Caleb, what about you? What are some things you want to see? What do you think?
Yeah, Soleil took my most micro level solution, which is call the restaurants you love directly and offer them money in whatever form or fashion you see fit. I think that a bigger scalable solution to that is to support the work that Saru and High Road Kitchens and other organizations in your cities are doing, which have a double bottom line where they're driving money into small business economies, supporting the employees of those businesses and feeding vulnerable populations. I think that's a really effective way to spread your money and to limit your risk. I think that like at a larger scale for anybody who is investing in restaurants or feels invested in restaurants, that we should really be insisting that we drive capital towards restaurant solutions that are regenerative, places that are healthier in general. You'll have a more just economy, a more innovative economy realistically, and probably a more delicious economy. So even if you don't think that this applies to you, I think that the outcomes are better. People will feel freer. This country can be better. And those are sort of micro decisions that people can make. On a broader macro level, I couldn't agree more that like activism has to be part of every single conversation. I think any conversation about restaurants is really a conversation about our economy. I think any conversation about our economy should begin with a conversation about reparations. So I think we should be ready to embrace a conversation about what does a reparative economy look like and how do we advocate and insist that that's a part of what we do. Universal health and childcare across the board would shift the responsibility away from restaurant owners and onto all of us to make sure that we have livable opportunities for working class people. Commercial rent abatement for the period of this pandemic and into the near future is something the federal government can make possible and should make possible, and would alleviate, again, the eviction cascades that you're going to see happen that are going to drive people out. A national holiday for voting would allow all of us to go vote because that's one small thing that we can do. And DC statehood, because that's my homeland, and that's 2 more votes in the right direction. And honestly, no one should be disenfranchised. Delicious food there too.
Brilliant, all of you. Okay, what I'd like to add into this conversation is where food comes from, the people growing the food, the people harvesting food, farmers, the connection of food to climate, and the connection of the pandemic and the situation we find ourselves in relative to issues of climate. And food at the center with regenerative agriculture, with sustainable agriculture as one huge tool in that box. Do you each want to just speak to that a bit as we enter the home stretch here?
I mean, I think hopefully people have seen the horrific data on the very high levels of infection and spread of the pandemic among both farm workers and meat and poultry processing workers. These are workers who've been lifting up their voices for pretty horrific working conditions and wages for a long time. And suddenly, again, it's a good thing. They're getting the attention they deserve for the really horrific conditions of farm workers and meat and poultry processing workers. There is also, I am seeing a new kind of interest in regenerative farming and growing and different ways of producing food. So I do think there's hope on the horizon, as horrific as it is, the conditions that we're seeing on the farms and in the meat and poultry processing plants. I think one of the beautiful things that could emerge out of this is to say that we call it taking the high road. That's why we call it High Road Kitchens. Employers that take the high road to profitability, that provide livable wages and working conditions. I think whether it's small farms that are interested in treating people well and treating animals well and the environment and the earth, or it's restaurant owners that are committing to go to one fair wage and increasing equity. I think that throughout the supply chain, consumers can have enormous impacts in driving a high road future. Let's think about a post-pandemic high road future in which all employers throughout the food supply are committed to a different and reimagined way of doing business, one that both really respects the planet and the other creatures on it, as well as the human beings that work for them.
What about you, Caleb? What are you thinking about in terms of farms and climate and land and agriculture we're eating and our health?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Sarah just said, like there's no way to divorce the people who are making your food from the food that you're eating, and then again from the life that you're living. And we should be demanding that all parts of that pipeline are honored and respected, because we are as much a part of that pipeline as anybody. I'm occasionally optimistic about those things, and I welcome all that optimism, and I think we need more of it. So, anyone who can bring optimism and then has the power to stand behind it, now's the time. Like, now's the time to declare what it is that we want, and then to pursue those solutions. So I'm grateful that you center it in this conversation. I think it's a shame that I didn't talk about it earlier. We didn't talk about it earlier, and I think it has to be a part of the conversation.
Lay, where do you weigh in here on this?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about how this stuff, right? Everything has, I think, in many cases, sparked more empathy towards people who work in those fields, to people who have those businesses, to people who work for those businesses, people who, fish in the ocean and in the bay, and people who harvest grapes. And I think people are more willing, just like broadly, to think about what they're going through, and to throw their support behind anyone who asks. So I think I'm also feeling optimistic that, there was a big fire at Fisherman's Wharf a few weeks ago, and so many people kind of rushed to help figure out how to help these fishermen and their industry, and just it was really encouraging to see. And I think people are a lot quicker to do that as well right now, and I hope that we keep that energy.
In closing, I'd like to thank this mighty panel: Soleil Ho, Caleb Zigas, Saru Jayaraman, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I also want to thank the Bay Area Book Festival. They grace under pressure, perseverance, and determination to make sure that this festival continued, that all these ideas were heard, especially this panel, because I think food and the issues that surround it are some of the ideas that have to be at the forefront as we go forward. I wanted to say that also this beautiful book by La Cocina, We Are La Cocina, Recipes in Pursuit of the American Dream, which is a stunning book, has all manner of recipes, and the women whose businesses, wait a minute, I'm going to find a photograph for you. It's the perfect book for now. Caleb, how many women's stories are in this book?
There's over 50 profiles of the women who have started businesses at La Cocina, and over 100 recipes from them.
There's just also, as people are in this soul-searching reinvention moment, there's a lot to be gained from reading this book now. A lot of courage and a lot of inspiration and a lot of hope. So I hope people turn to this book. This book and Saru's book that she co-edited with Catherine DeMaster, Fight Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning, are available. There's going to be a website that we show you on the screen as this finishes, and the book can be ordered here, and then it'll be delivered to you directly. I do want to thank also Bay Area booksellers who have kept their doors, opened their doors again, who are trying to keep the lights on, their staffs employed, and the ideas flowing, who want to make sure that writers are supported and the revolutionary ideas they have heard. I'm Davia Nelson from the Kitchen Sisters on behalf of Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival. Thank you for joining us.